a high heel flying straight at her face, blood streaming down, and stinging curses. That was the price 9-year-old Margaret had to pay for nothing more than a uniform that hadn't dried in time. In the eyes of her daughter-in-law, Jennifer, she was nothing but old trash, a leech living in their home. But Jennifer had made a fatal mistake. She had no idea that this frail old woman, trembling as she wiped the blood from her lip, held a shocking secret. Beneath a worn-out mattress, inside a faded wooden box, lay yellowed papers with the power to throw Jennifer out on the street and strip her of everything she so proudly claimed as her own. From an abuse victim to the wielder of justice, Margaret's journey to reclaim her dignity will move you to tears, and the ultimate fate of her cruel daughter-in-law will leave you completely satisfied. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment and subscribe, because there are truths that need to be spread, even if they might shake your beliefs. There are stories that, no matter how painful, simply must be told. "Shut up, you old trash." Jennifer's scream shattered the calm of the morning like unexpected thunder, causing Margaret to shrink into herself, her heart beating wildly against her ribs. It was barely dawn, and the kitchen, usually a haven of tranquility at that hour, had turned into a battlefield. The steam from the freshly brewed coffee mixed with the sour smell of anger. Margaret, with her 79 years weighing on her, and hands knobby from arthritis, had been carefully folding clean towels, trying to be useful, trying not to be in the way. Her presence in that house, the house of her son Stephen and her daughter-in-law Jennifer, was a concession, a favor they reminded her of at every moment. Since a mudslide took her small cottage in the countryside of Washington State, her only refuge, her life had been reduced to a silent promise to stay still. "Jennifer, Mason's uniform is still a little damp. I left it drying on the rack since last night, but with the Seattle rain and humidity." Margaret's voice was a barely audible thread, an apology in advance, loaded with the good intentions of a worried grandmother. She had spent the night awake, thinking about her grandson's soccer game, about the importance of everything being perfect. She had scrubbed the grass stain with care, had hung the fabric hoping the early morning air would work its magic, but the capricious Pacific Northwest weather had not cooperated. The dampness of the night had clung to the fibers of the fabric, refusing to yield. Margaret had checked the uniform again and again, her tired eyes scrutinizing every fold, hoping a miracle would dry it before departure time. But it wasn't so, and now that small imperfection, a slightly damp uniform, had become the spark that lit the fuse. Jennifer, who was already standing by the door with her purse in one hand and a frown on her face, spun around with the speed of lightning, her dark eyes flashing with a contained fury that Margaret knew too well. It was a fury that accumulated, bubbling under the surface until any small spark made it explode. "Useless. You're always in the way, old trash." Jennifer's voice was a whip, every word a direct blow to Margaret's chest. The air became dense, unbreathable. The grandmother felt her blood freeze in her veins. The word trash stuck in her soul, sharper than any knife. She, who had raised Stephen with so much effort, who had worked all her life without rest in the textile mill, folding fabrics and sewing other people's dreams, who had arrived in this country with nothing more than hope, and had built a life with the sweat of her brow, with every fiber of her being. Now she was trash, scraps. Jennifer approached her with firm steps, her face contracted by contempt, every muscle in her face tensed by rage, as if she were about to explode. "It's your fault we're late for practice. It's your fault Mason is going to lose the game, always ruining everything. What are you good for, huh? Why are you still here if you can't even do the bare minimum, right?" Jennifer's voice rose in pitch, shrill, filling every corner of the kitchen, bouncing off the walls, suffocating Margaret. The grandmother felt the heat in her cheeks, not from shame, but from a deep humiliation, one that burned inside her like a slow fire consuming her dignity, her pride, everything that defined her. Her eyes, already tired from the years, sought Stephen, her son, her only blood, her reason for being. He was standing by the refrigerator, watching the scene in silence, a glass of orange juice in his hand, his face impassive, as if it had nothing to do with him, as if his mother wasn't being destroyed in front of his own eyes. Stephen's silence was not just an absence of sound, It was a deafening declaration of abandonment. To Margaret, that silence cut deeper than the sharp heel striking her face. It was the sound of the umbilical cord, the sacred bond she had nurtured with her own life being severed by cowardice. As she looked at him, she didn't see a man. She saw the little boy she had once protected from the world, now standing by and watching the world destroy her. That betrayal, that cold indifference from her own flesh and blood, was the true fatal blow, shattering her heart into pieces that no amount of apology could ever glue back together. It is truly heartbreaking to witness a mother being abandoned by the very son she raised, a pain that cuts far deeper than the physical wound on her face. But if you think Margaret is going to let this betrayal break her spirit completely, you are about to be surprised by the hidden strength of this incredible woman. Keep listening, because her reaction to this cruelty is the start of something powerful. "Shut up, you old trash." Jennifer's scream shattered the morning calm. In a blur of motion fueled by pure malice, she bent down, snatched the high heel from her foot, and hurled it with calculated violence. It wasn't an accident. It was a projectile meant to annihilate. Margaret, her reflexes slowed by age and shock, had no time to react. The sharp heel struck her upper lip with a sickening thud, tearing the fragile skin. A metallic taste filled her mouth, instantly blood, warm and acrid. As she collapsed to the cold kitchen tiles, the shoe skidded to a stop near her hand, a cruel monument to her humiliation, a mute and cruel testimony of the violence just unleashed, of the humiliation she had just suffered, of the loss of her last vestige of respect. With a trembling hand, Margaret brought her fingers to her mouth, feeling the swollen lip, the deep cut, the blood welling up. Upon withdrawing them, she saw them stained a dark red, a vivid red that contrasted with the pallor of her skin, the color of her own blood spilled on the floor of her son's kitchen by the hand of her daughter-in-law. The physical pain was intense, a constant burning that spread across her face, her head, her whole body. But the pain in her soul was 1,000 times worse. The humiliation, the indignity of that act, pierced her to the deepest part of her being, burning her inside, consuming her insides. Her eyes filled with tears, hot tears that threatened to overflow, but she didn't let them fall. She held them back, pressing her lips together, feeling the sting of the wound, the lump in her throat that prevented her from breathing, from screaming. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry, of seeing her completely broken, of seeing her crumble on the floor. No, not yet. Despite the pain, despite the blood, despite the betrayal, a tiny but fierce spark of resistance lit up in the deepest part of her heart. A spark that promised that this wouldn't be the end, that she wouldn't stay on the floor, that she would get up, however difficult it might be. Dignity, that word so worn out, so often forgotten, resonated in her mind. She still had dignity even if they tried to rip it away from her, and that dignity, she thought, would be her weapon. The silence in the kitchen was thick, heavy, more oppressive than Jennifer's scream. "Miss!" Margaret was sitting on the cold floor, her back leaning against the cabinet under the sink, her hand still pressed against her bleeding mouth. The metallic taste of blood mixed with the bitter taste of humiliation. Jennifer's shoe, the weapon of her aggression, lay a few inches from her feet, a cruel reminder of what had just happened. The morning light, which had earlier promised a new day, now seemed to mock her, illuminating her helplessness, revealing every detail of her pain. Her eyes, filled with a pain that went beyond the physical, a pain that soaked into her bones, slowly lifted, seeking an answer, a reaction, a glimmer of humanity. First, she looked at Jennifer. The daughter-in-law stood with her arms crossed, her chest heaving from rapid breathing, but her face no longer showed fury. In its place was an expression of cold indifference, almost satisfaction, as if the act of violence had relieved her of some burden, as if she had purged a nuisance. There was no regret, no concern, not a shred of remorse in her eyes, only a stony hardness that froze Margaret's blood. It was as if she hadn't hit an old woman, her husband's mother, but a valueless object, that old trash she had pronounced with such contempt, a thing that could be discarded or mistreated without consequences. Stephen's betrayal was a poison spreading through her veins, paralyzing her, leaving her breathless, without hope. The pain in her lip was a constant stabbing, a burning spreading across her face, but the stabbing in her heart was 1,000 times worse. She felt she lacked air, that the kitchen walls were closing in on her, that the ceiling would collapse on her. The humiliation was a cold, sticky layer covering her from head to toe, a cloak of shame that made her feel small, insignificant, a burden, a hindrance, just as Jennifer had called her. But in the deepest part of her being, despite the despair, despite the pain, a spark of pride, a silent resistance, ignited. She wouldn't stay there. She wouldn't stay lying on the floor like a beaten dog, waiting for compassion that would never come. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction, that victory. With an effort that seemed superhuman to her, Margaret pressed her hands against the cold, rough floor. Her fingers, stiff from arthritis, complained with stabbing pain, but she ignored them. Slowly, with the dignity she had left, with the strength of a will that refused to break, she began to rise. Every muscle in her body protested. Every joint creaked like old hinges, but she forced herself to stand. The movement was slow, laborious, an act of pure will, of pure resistance. She swayed a little at first, the world spinning around her, but she stood firm, upright, despite the pain coursing through her body, despite the dizziness. She didn't look at Jennifer, didn't look at Stephen. Her eyes were fixed on a point beyond them, on an uncertain future, but one in which she wouldn't be lying on the floor, humiliated. With her hand still pressing her lip, feeling the warm flow of blood, Margaret headed toward the sink. She turned on the faucet, the cold water running over her fingers, washing away the blood, washing away the humiliation, trying to wash away the pain she felt in every fiber of her being. The silence in the kitchen was so absolute, she could hear the dripping of the water, the beating of her own heart, a slow but firm drumming resonating in her ears. Stephen still didn't move, didn't speak. Jennifer continued with her expression of indifference, her empty gaze. It was as if Margaret were invisible, as if her pain didn't exist, as if she weren't a person, but a shadow moving on the periphery of their lives, voiceless, without rights. But Margaret no longer sought their compassion, nor their recognition, nor their love. At that moment, in that silence loaded with contempt, a cold and silent determination took root in her heart. It was no longer just the pain of betrayal or the bitterness of humiliation. It was a decision, a promise to herself. This would not stay like this. This was not the end. With a swollen lip and a broken soul, but with a new strength being born inside her, Margaret dried her hands with a kitchen towel. Her eyes, though still misted by held-back tears, now had a different shine, a steel glint, a light that hadn't been there before. She had been hit, humiliated, betrayed, but she was not defeated. The blow of the shoe had been a catalyst, a turning point. It had awakened something in her, something that had been dormant under years of submission and silence, under the layer of resignation. It was the spark of survival, the flame of dignity that still burned in the deepest part of her being. And that flame, however small, would start to illuminate the path toward something different, something she didn't yet know what it was, but she knew she had to find. The Margaret who rose from the floor was not the same one who had fallen. It was a wounded Margaret, yes, but also a Margaret determined never to be trampled on again. Night fell over the house with the same coldness with which it had dawned. Miss. Margaret moved like a shadow, her steps dragging down the hallway, her lips swollen and sore, a constant reminder of the morning's aggression. Every beat of her heart was an echo of the blow, every breath a sigh of pain. The aroma of dinner filtering from the kitchen was of roast chicken and potatoes, a feast she would not share. Her place was not at the table, next to her son and daughter-in-law, next to her grandchildren. Her place was on the periphery, in the darkness, in the silence. A silence that seemed louder to her than any scream. When the family finished dinner, Margaret waited. She waited for the call, the signal, the crumb they would throw her. Finally, Jennifer appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face expressionless, like a stone mask. "You're useless now, old woman. Why are you still here?" The words were a slow poison, dripping onto her soul, more painful than the physical blow. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a sentence, a confirmation of her uselessness, of her being a hindrance, of her absolute lack of value in her daughter-in-law's eyes. Margaret didn't answer. She no longer had the strength to defend herself with words no one would listen to. She approached the table where dirty dishes were piled up, leftover food scattered, crumbs of someone else's happiness. She took a plate of rice that had remained at the bottom of the pot, cold and sticky, and a piece of chicken that seemed to have been forgotten, dry and flavorless. It was her dinner, the same routine as always. But today the taste of cold food mixed with the bitter taste of humiliation, with the aftertaste of blood in her mouth. She ate in silence, sitting alone in a corner of the kitchen, the dim light of the bulb illuminating her tired face, her sunken eyes. Every bite was an act of survival, not enjoyment, a basic necessity to maintain the body, even if the soul was crumbling. After dinner, she headed to the back room. Her room. It wasn't a bedroom in the real sense of the word, but a small space, barely a cubicle, that had previously been a storage room. The walls, bare and stained, seemed to shrink around her. The air was heavy, loaded with the stale smell of humidity and mold that got into her lungs, reminding her of her own decay. There were no windows, only a small slit near the ceiling that let in a minimum of light during the day and offered no ventilation, making every night a struggle against stale air. The heat was suffocating in summer, the cold soaked the bones in winter. And now, on this night of early autumn in Washington, the dampness made every joint ache. Her bed was a thin mattress, almost a mat, thrown directly on the cement floor, hard and cold. There were no clean sheets, only a threadbare blanket that didn't provide enough warmth and smelled of confinement. The only comfort was a naked bulb hanging from the ceiling with a switch that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, plunging her into total darkness. There was no closet, only a couple of rusty hooks on the wall to hang her few clothes, a couple of worn dresses and a jacket. And worst of all, the door had no lock on the inside. It was a cruel irony. "This isn't a nursing home, lady. You shut up and be grateful," Jennifer had told her when Margaret dared to ask for a little more privacy, for a minimum of security. That phrase, repeated again and again, had been branded into her mind, a constant reminder of her place in that house. A prisoner, without rights, without a voice. She sat on the mattress, her body aching, her mind exhausted, but strangely lucid. Darkness enveloped her, broken only by the dim light filtering under the door, a crack reminding her of the life going on outside her confinement. The sounds of the house arrived muffled, the television in the living room, the laughter of the grandchildren, the voices of Stephen and Jennifer, sometimes arguing, sometimes laughing. They were sounds of a life that was alien to her, a life from which she was excluded. Despite living under the same roof, she felt like a prisoner in her own home, a shadow in the life of her own family, a ghost no one wanted to see. She closed her eyes, trying to find a little peace, a little oblivion, a respite from reality. But the images of the morning repeated in her mind with painful sharpness. The shoe flying through the air, the impact, the blood, Jennifer's impassive face, Stephen's averted gaze, and the words, oh, the words, old trash, useless, you serve no purpose anymore. Each one of them was a thorn stuck in her heart, twisting with every beat. She remembered her own little cottage in the countryside, a humble cottage, but full of life, with a small garden where she grew her own vegetables. She remembered the smell of wet earth after the rain, the singing of birds at dawn, the warmth of the sun on her porch, where she knitted blankets for the winters. She remembered Robert, her late husband, sitting by her side sharing a coffee, his strong and protective hands, his laughter resonating in the air. She remembered the years of work in the bakery of her town, the aroma of freshly baked bread clinging to her skin, the laughter of customers, the satisfaction of a job well done, of having served her community. All that was gone. Everything had vanished like smoke, leaving only this desolate present, this imposed misery. The tears she had held back during the day now welled up silent and bitter. They fell down her wrinkled cheeks, soaking the thin pillow, a pillow that smelled of despair. She wept for the lost house, for her husband, for the life that had been snatched from her. She wept for her son's betrayal, for her daughter-in-law's cruelty. She wept for the dignity she felt they were taking from her piece by piece, every day, every hour, every minute. The arthritis in her hands hurt, a chronic pain adding to the pain of the soul, a constant stabbing, reminding her of her fragility. Her fingers, which had previously kneaded dough with strength and dexterity, could now barely hold a glass of water without trembling. She felt trapped, with no way out. Where would an old woman go without money, without a house, without family that wanted her? The street was a terrifying possibility, a reality looming over her like a constant threat. The cold, the hunger, the loneliness, the idea of a nursing home, of being abandoned in a strange place among strangers, terrified her even more. It was a humiliation she couldn't bear, a final surrender. But in the midst of that torrent of despair, something moved inside her. A small voice, almost a whisper, rose above the crying, above the pain, above the fear. It is heartbreaking to see a woman who gave so much be reduced to a shadow in her own home, but do not mistake her tears for defeat. That small voice rising in the darkness is the first sign that the resilient Margaret of the past is about to return. Keep listening, because her submission is about to end. It was the voice of her grandmother, who had taught her that dignity is not bought or sold, that it is carried inside like a sacred treasure. It was the voice of Robert, who always told her she was the strongest woman he knew, a lioness capable of overcoming any adversity. It was the voice of the young Margaret who arrived in this country with nothing and built a life from scratch, with pure grit and determination. She couldn't go on like this. She couldn't keep being the old trash, the useless burden. There had to be another way. She didn't know which one. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have strength. But the spark that had ignited in the kitchen, that spark of resistance, now shone a little brighter in the darkness of her small room, illuminating an uncertain path. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let herself be defeated. She wouldn't die silent. The night was long and the pain was deep. But in the deepest part of her being, Miss Margaret felt that something had changed. The submission had reached its limit. It was time to fight for what was left of her, for her own dignity, for a last breath of respect. The battle was just beginning. The morning following the shoe strike, Miss Margaret woke up with her lips still swollen, and a constant stab of pain reminding her of the brutality of the previous night. The cold of the cement floor had seeped into her bones, and the dampness of the small room made every joint ache. But beyond the physical pain, it was the wound in the soul that wouldn't heal. Stephen's indifference, Jennifer's cruelty, the feeling of being a burden, a voiceless shadow in her own family. All that weighed on her like a slab. She got up slowly, every movement an effort, and dragged herself to the small sink she shared with the washing machine, where she washed her face with cold water, trying to dispel the fatigue and bitterness. As she dried her face with a rough cloth, her thoughts drifted toward the only thread of hope she had left, the last vestige of her independence, her Social Security pension. That money, although modest, was the fruit of a lifetime of work, of years of effort in the factory, folding fabrics under fluorescent lights, with the constant hum of machines as the soundtrack of her youth and maturity. Every penny of that pension represented sweat, sacrifices, the promise of a calm, dignified old age. She had dreamed of using it to fix up her little cottage in the country, to buy medicines, to treat herself to something small every now and then, a sweet, a flower for the Virgin's altar. But since the landslide took her home, since she was forced to live under her son's roof, that money had disappeared into an abyss of empty promises and excuses. The check arrived every month religiously to Stephen's account. That was what they had told her. She didn't understand banks, or transfers, or numbers on a screen. She trusted her son, the blood of her blood. At first, Stephen had assured her the money was safe, that he was keeping it for her needs. But the needs never arrived, or if they did, they were ignored. When she asked for a little for medicine, for a pair of new shoes that wouldn't hurt her feet, there was always an excuse. There isn't any, Mom. We already used it for this or that. Don't be demanding. The word demanding burned her. She who had never asked for anything, who had always been the one giving, the one working, the one sacrificing for others. Today, however, yesterday's humiliation had ignited a spark. She could no longer stay silent. She could no longer keep accepting the crumbs of a life that wasn't hers. Her pension was hers, her right, her last bastion of dignity. With a determination she hadn't felt in years, a mixture of contained rage and despair, she decided it was time to ask, no longer with the trembling voice of before, but with a firmness she tried to project. Even if inside she felt an uncontrollable tremor, she waited for the opportune moment. The kitchen was silent. Stephen had already left for work, and the kids were at school. Only Jennifer was there sitting at the table, drinking coffee and checking her cell phone, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Margaret. The grandmother approached with slow steps, her heart beating strongly in her chest, like a war drum. The smell of coffee and toast filled the air, a cruel contrast to the emptiness she felt in her stomach and soul. "Jennifer," Margaret said, her voice a little stronger than she expected, although still with a nuance of pleading, of uncertainty. "I wanted to ask you about my pension check. It's already the end of the month and I haven't seen anything. I need some medicine for my arthritis." And Jennifer looked up from the cell phone, her dark eyes cold without a shred of empathy, her lip curled into a grimace of contempt, an expression Margaret knew too well, one that anticipated the verbal lashing that was about to come. She slammed the cell phone on the table with a dry thud, the sound resonating in the silence of the kitchen. "Your pension," Jennifer snapped, her voice loaded with irony and disdain. "Still on about that, old woman. Don't you get tired of asking? We already used it for the rent, for food, for your own expenses. What, you want luxuries, too? You want us to buy you jewelry? Perhaps? This isn't a 5-star hotel, it's our house, and you are a burden." Every word was a sharp and precise dagger, straight to Margaret's heart. The accusation of being a burden stuck in her mind, resonating strongly, a cruel truth that left her breathless. Margaret felt the blood rushing to her face, not from shame, but from deep indignation. Her pension for the rent, for her own expenses. She ate scraps, slept in a storeroom without ventilation, and her medicines were a luxury rarely granted to her. It was a blatant lie, a cruel mockery of her naivety, of her trust. Her son's promise that the money was safe, that it was for her, vanished like smoke, revealing the raw truth. They were robbing her, taking away the little she had left, her last resource, her only security. But Stephen told me he was saving it. Margaret stammered, her voice now trembling, hope fading like sand between fingers. "He told me it was for me." Jennifer let out a dry laugh, joyless, a laugh that sounded like mockery, like contempt. "Stephen says a lot of things, old woman, but reality is different. Here we live on what there is, and your pension is what there is. Or do you prefer to live on the street? Because if you keep up with your complaints, that's what awaits you. This isn't a nursing home, lady. You shut up and be grateful." The threat was clear, direct, blunt. The street, with its cold, its hunger, its loneliness. The street, the final destination of so many forgotten elderly people. The street, the only alternative they offered her. Margaret remained silent, paralyzed by the magnitude of the betrayal. Not only had they taken her money, but they had stripped her of her dignity, of her voice, of her right to ask, to demand what was hers. She felt empty, stripped of everything, even hope. Jennifer's words resonated in her head. Burden, useless, old trash. They were the soundtrack of her new reality, but in the midst of that desolation, something reaffirmed itself inside her. The spark ignited by the shoe strike, that spark of resistance, was now fanned by the gasoline of indignation. She couldn't go on like this. She couldn't let them trample her that way. She couldn't die silent, stripped of everything, without having fought for the little she had left. The pension was more than money. It was her autonomy, her value, her existence. And she wouldn't let them take it without a fight. Night loomed over the house, bringing with it the same oppressive silence as always, a silence only broken by the distant noises of the television in the living room, the muffled laughter of her grandchildren, and the voices of Stephen and Jennifer, speaking of their plans, their worries, of a life in which Margaret had no place. In her small room, darkness was almost total. Only a slit of light leaked under the door, a reminder of the life going on outside her confinement. Margaret was lying on her thin mattress, her body aching, her lips still throbbing, but it was the pain in the soul that consumed her. Jennifer's words resonated in her head again and again. Burden, useless, old trash. This isn't a nursing home, and the cruelest of all. Here we live on what there is, and your pension is what there is. The idea that her own son and daughter-in-law had stolen her pension, the fruit of her whole life of work, filled her with silent rage, with an impotence that squeezed her chest. The tears she had tried to hold back during the day now welled up uncontrollably, silent and bitter, soaking the pillow. She cried for the injustice, for the loneliness, for the life taken from her, for the dignity she felt was being taken, piece by piece. She felt trapped, with no way out, an old woman without money, without a house, without anyone who truly loved her. Suddenly, the door of her room opened with a soft creak and a small silhouette slipped into the darkness. Margaret started. Her heart skipped a beat, thinking it was Jennifer, coming to scold or humiliate her again, but no. It was Chloe, her youngest granddaughter, barely 10 years old, with her large, curious eyes shining in the gloom. The girl held a cloth handkerchief soaked in cold water in her hand and approached the bed with cautious steps, as if fearing to startle a wounded animal. "Grandma," Chloe whispered, her voice small and sweet, a balm for Margaret's soul. "I saw you crying. Does it hurt a lot?" Margaret sat up a little, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Chloe's presence was a ray of light in her darkness, an unexpected comfort. "Not as much as what she said, my child," Margaret replied, her voice hoarse from held-back crying. "My soul hurts more than my body." Chloe sat carefully on the edge of the mattress, her small hand extending the damp cloth. "Put it on your mouth, Grandma, to bring down the swelling." Margaret took the cloth, feeling the comforting cold on her wounded lip, a gesture of tenderness she hadn't received in a long time. Chloe's eyes were fixed on her face, full of genuine concern, of an empathy she didn't find in the adults of that house. The girl, with her innocence and pure heart, was the only one who seemed to see her, the only one who seemed to care about her pain. "Why do they yell at you like that, Grandma?" Chloe asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not fair. You always take care of us, make us food, read us stories." Margaret sighed, a sigh loaded with resignation. "What can I tell you, my child? Sometimes people forget that old folks have feelings too, that we also have a heart." Chloe remained silent for a moment, thoughtful, her eyes fixed on the floor. Then, as if a brilliant idea had crossed her mind, she looked up and her eyes shone with a determination unusual for her age. "Grandma," she said, her voice a little stronger, full of new conviction, "my mom has an old cell phone. Sometimes she leaves it lying around. And if we record it? So everyone can see. So they know what they do to you." Chloe's proposal took her by surprise. Record. The idea was so simple, so bold, so outside her understanding of the modern world. Margaret, who barely knew how to use a landline, stared at her granddaughter with a mixture of amazement and hope. Record? What for? Who would see it? Would it do any good? But Chloe's look was so serious, so full of conviction that Margaret felt a pang of curiosity, a small flame of possibility. "Record what, my child?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "And who would see it?" Chloe smiled, a small smile but full of mischief. "Everything, Grandma. When they yell at you, when they say ugly things. And we upload it to the internet. My mom always says that on the internet everything goes viral, that people see everything, and that sometimes good people help. Sometimes it takes the innocence of a child to see the clearest path to justice when the adults are too blind to see it." Chloe's risky idea to record the abuse is a gamble that could make things much worse if they get caught, but it might just be the lifeline Margaret needs. You won't believe how far this little secret is about to travel. Chloe's innocence, her faith in justice, in the kindness of strangers, was moving. For Margaret, the internet was an abstract concept, an invisible web she didn't understand. But the idea that her voice, her pain, could be heard by someone, by anyone, was a possibility she hadn't dared to imagine. The girl's proposal was a risk. Of course, if Jennifer found out, the fury would be even worse. But what else did she have to lose? They had already taken her house, her pension, her dignity. They had already hit her, threatened her with the street. The fear that had paralyzed her for so long now mixed with a new emotion: determination. The idea that her story could be told, that her suffering could be visible. It was a balm for her wounded soul. It was a way to regain a little control, not to die silent. "Do you think it will work, my child?" Margaret asked, her voice a thread of hope. Chloe nodded her head, her eyes shining with a light of complicity. "Yes, Grandma. Trust me. Tomorrow, when no one is here, we'll do it. You just have to tell the truth. The truth always comes to light." Chloe's small hand rested on Margaret's, a soft but firm touch, a silent promise of support. At that moment, in the darkness of her small room, Margaret felt she wasn't completely alone. She had Chloe, her little ally, her ray of hope. And that hope, however small, was enough to light the flame of the fight. The morning sun barely sneaked through the small crack of the room, painting the dust in the air with a dim glow. Margaret had woken up with a mixture of nervousness and a strange sense of purpose. The idea Chloe had planted in her mind the night before had germinated, growing in the darkness of her despair. Record, tell her truth. The possibility that her voice would be heard, that her suffering wouldn't be in vain, gave her a strength she hadn't felt in a long time. They waited for the opportune moment. Stephen and Jennifer had left for work, and the other grandchildren were at school. The house was silent, a silence that was no longer oppressive, but conspiratorial. Chloe, with the seriousness of a little conspirator, slipped down the hall and returned with her mother's old cell phone, a rectangular and worn device, with the screen a bit scratched. She handled it with a dexterity Margaret couldn't comprehend, her small fingers flying over the screen, opening applications, adjusting the camera. "Ready, Grandma," Chloe whispered, her eyes shining with excitement. "You just have to look here at this little circle and say what you feel, what they do to you. Don't be afraid." Margaret felt a knot in her stomach. Her heart beat strongly, as if it wanted to burst out of her chest. Her lip hurt, and upon touching it she felt the cut still sensitive, the lump of swelling. It was the perfect reminder of humiliation, the tangible proof of her pain. She looked at herself in the dark reflection of the cell phone screen, her face furrowed by wrinkles, her tired eyes, her swollen and bruised lip. It was the image of a battered woman, of a mistreated old woman. And that image, she thought, was the truth. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the trembling in her hands. She thought of her lost cottage, of Robert, of her stolen pension, of the cold nights in that room, of Jennifer's cruel words, of Stephen's indifference. She thought of all the times she had cried in silence, of all the times she had wanted to scream and couldn't. And now, finally, she had a chance. A small window for the world to see what happened behind the walls of that house, of that family that called itself normal. Chloe lifted the cell phone, pointing the camera at her grandmother. "Whenever you want, Grandma. Just tell the truth." Margaret nodded, her eyes fixed on the small camera lens. Her voice at first came out a little hoarse, broken by emotion and fear. But as she spoke, she gained strength, a strength coming from the deepest part of her being, from the dignity refusing to die. "My name is Margaret," her voice began, a thread but firm. "I am 79 years old, and this is my story." She paused, swallowing saliva, feeling the burning in her throat. "My daughter-in-law hit me, threw a shoe in my face, calls me trash, calls me useless, humiliates me every day. And my son sees it and keeps quiet." The words came out with brutal sincerity, without adornments, without complaints, just the raw truth. Margaret's gaze hardened. Her eyes, though tired, reflected an iron determination. "They took my cottage. They took my pension. The money from my whole life of work. They took my dignity. They tell me I'm good for nothing, that I'm a burden, that this isn't a nursing home. They threaten to throw me in the street." A solitary tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it. She let it run, a silent testimony of her pain. "But," Margaret continued, her voice now stronger, resonating with unwavering conviction, "even though they've taken almost everything from me, even though I have no teeth left in my mouth, even though my hands are knobby with arthritis, I still have something left. I still have dignity." Her voice rose, filling the small room, a declaration of resistance, a silent scream seeking to be heard. They yell at me, they hit me, they humiliate me, but I am not going to die silent. I am not going to die without the world knowing the truth. Chloe, holding the cell phone with both hands, looked at her grandmother with amazement, her own eyes full of tears. She had seen her grandmother cry, but she had never seen her so strong, so determined. Margaret's voice was a torrent of emotions, a mixture of pain, rage, and immense bravery. It was the voice of a woman who had been silenced for too long and who now, finally, found a way to scream her truth to the world. When Margaret finished speaking, silence fell over the room again. But this time, it was a different silence, loaded with the resonance of her words, the strength of her testimony. Chloe lowered the cell phone. Her hands trembled slightly. "Done, Grandma," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's recorded. Now everyone is going to know." Margaret looked at the cell phone screen, where her wounded face and defiant gaze remained motionless, captured forever. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know if that small video would change anything, if anyone would see it, if anyone would care. But in that moment she felt strangely liberated. She had spoken. She had broken the silence. She had planted a seed of truth in a world of lies. And that seed, however small, had the potential to grow, to spread, to change everything. The dignity they had tried to snatch from her now shone with its own light, a light no darkness could put out. The small cell phone, with its scratched screen and modest camera, became the most powerful weapon Miss Margaret could have ever imagined. After the grandmother finished speaking, with her voice loaded with truth and pain, Chloe, with firm hands for her age, stopped the recording. Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with a mixture of amazement and silent determination. She had captured the essence of injustice. Her grandmother's voice, the testimony of a life of abuse. For her, it was an act of love. For the world, it would be a revelation. The silence in the room was dense, but not the oppressive silence of before, rather one loaded with the resonance of Margaret's words, an echo of bravery floating in the air. Chloe felt a shiver, a mixture of fear and excitement, holding in her small hands the device containing the truth. With the same discretion with which she had entered the room, Chloe slipped out, the cell phone hidden in her pants pocket. Her heart beat with the thrill of a secret mission. There was no time to lose. She knew her parents would return from work soon, and the risk of being discovered was immense. Every step she took down the creaky hallway was an act of bravery. She headed to the most secluded corner of the house, a small backyard patio where they used to dry clothes. There, under the open sky, with the morning sunlight as a silent witness, she prepared to upload the video. Her fingers, small and agile, accustomed to games on the cell phone, now moved with unusual seriousness, navigating menus, looking for the right option. Chloe wasn't a social media expert, but she had learned enough watching her older siblings and her own mother. She created an anonymous account, a name that wouldn't give her away, something simple and traceless. With fast fingers, she selected the video from the gallery. Her grandmother's image, with her swollen lip and eyes full of unbreakable dignity, filled the small screen. She wrote a simple but forceful title that came straight from her heart. "My grandma, beaten and humiliated, needs help." She didn't add more, didn't make a speech, just the truth, raw and direct, accompanied by the image that said it all. She pressed the publish button and felt a shiver run down her back. It was a leap into the void, a bottle thrown into the sea, a hope sent to the digital universe. The magic, or perhaps the raw reality of the internet, did its work with amazing speed. In a matter of minutes, the video, so small and personal, began to move. First, a few likes from people who found it by chance. Then the first comments of astonishment and rage. "How barbaric. Poor grandma. Report those monsters." People, strangers from all over, began to share it. A click, another click, and so Miss Margaret's testimony began to fly through the network, from one phone to another, from one screen to another, like a trail of gunpowder igniting uncontrollably. Indignation grew with every view, with every comment, with every share. The grandmother's story, with her wounded face and firm voice, resonated in thousands of hearts. Empathy overflowed, and with it the thirst for justice. In less than an hour, Miss Margaret's video had not only gone viral, it had exploded. The view counts went up at a dizzying speed, comments multiplied by thousands, and shares didn't stop. The grandmother's story became the topic of the day, of the hour, in every corner of the network. The indignation was palpable. People couldn't believe what they saw. The cruelty, the indifference, the mistreatment of an old woman. Messages of support for Margaret mixed with condemnation of the aggressors, demanding action, asking for an investigation, for something to be done. Meanwhile, Stephen and Jennifer, oblivious to the storm brewing, continued with their normal day. Stephen was at his job, concentrated on his tasks. Jennifer at home, immersed in her own occupations, with the cell phone in hand as always. Suddenly, Jennifer's phone started ringing non-stop, one call after another, text messages that didn't stop arriving, social media notifications piling up. At first she ignored it, thinking they were unimportant notifications, some gossip or advertising, but then her sister, her cousin, her best friend, all called her insistently, their voices sounding increasingly upset. "What's wrong with you? Did you see what's circulating? It's crazy." Her sister's voice sounded hysterical on the other end of the line. Jennifer frowned, annoyed by the interruption, opened one of the notifications, and what she saw left her frozen. It was the video. Margaret's face, her mother-in-law, with her swollen lip, speaking directly to the camera. And what she said was a direct accusation, a time bomb that had just exploded in her face. "My daughter-in-law hit me." Margaret's voice resonated from the cell phone screen, clear and painful. "She calls me trash. She humiliates me every day, and my son sees it and keeps quiet." Jennifer's face fell apart. Her eyes opened wide, her skin went pale, and then a furious red covered it, a tide of anger and shame. The cell phone slipped from her hands, falling to the floor with a dull thud that resonated in the silence of the kitchen. It couldn't be. It couldn't be that useless old woman had done something like that. How? When? Who had helped her? Rage consumed her, a blind, uncontrollable rage that clouded her judgment. She got up suddenly, throwing the chair to the floor with a crash, and started screaming, with her voice torn by fury, fists clenched. "I'm going to put that old woman in a nursing home right now. I swear, she won't see the light of day again. How dare she? How dare she do this to me?" Her screams resonated through the house, filling the air with contained violence, with unleashed fury. Public humiliation was a direct blow to her pride, to her image, to the life she had built with lies and abuse. Fear mixed with anger. Fear of consequences, of exposure, of the shame that would now pursue her. But it was too late. The video was no longer hers, nor Margaret's, nor Chloe's. The video belonged to the world, and the world now knew. It is deeply satisfying to witness the moment a bully realizes they have lost control to the one thing they can't intimidate: the truth. Jennifer is reacting with the only weapon she has left: rage, but she fails to grasp that the internet has already stripped her of her power. The storm has officially made landfall, and next, we'll see how this public exposure shatters Stephen's fragile world of silence. News of the video spread like an unstoppable and voracious forest fire. It wasn't just another viral clip. It was the story of an injustice, a cry for help resonating in people's hearts, a mirror reflecting hidden cruelty. Miss Margaret's face, with her expression of pain and dignity, became a symbol of the fragility of the elderly and the indifference of society. Social networks burned with comments supporting the grandmother and condemning her aggressors. People shared the video again and again, demanding justice, asking for an investigation, for something to be done. The indignation was collective, and social pressure began to be felt. Slow, but relentless, on Stephen and Jennifer, suffocating them little by little. Stephen was the first to feel the blow at his job. He was a man of few words, who had always stayed on the sidelines of his household problems, letting Jennifer handle his mother at her whim, believing that way he freed himself from responsibilities. But indifference now had a very high price. His cell phone wouldn't stop vibrating with messages and calls from colleagues, friends, even his boss. At first he thought it was a joke, some unimportant office gossip. But when he opened the video sent by a coworker, cold sweat ran down his back and a knot formed in his stomach. It was his mother, with a swollen lip, talking about abuse, humiliation, stolen pension, and the worst part, his own image, appeared in the narration, that of a son who sees and keeps quiet, a silent accomplice. The whispers in the office were incessant. The looks from his co-workers, previously indifferent or friendly, were now loaded with judgment, contempt, pity. Laughter died down as he passed and conversations silenced abruptly when he approached. Stephen felt exposed, vulnerable, as if everyone could see the rot of his home, the shame of his silence. His boss called him into the office with a serious expression and grave voice. "Stephen, what is this? We are receiving calls. Our company cannot be associated with this type of situation. We need you to resolve this, and fast." The threat was clear, direct, and blunt. His job, his livelihood, was at stake. The fear, which he had previously only felt from Jennifer's reactions, now extended to his own life, to his uncertain future. At the grandchildren's school, the situation was no different. Teachers, parents, the children themselves, everyone had seen the video. The whispers in the hallways, the looks of pity toward Chloe, who was now seen as a silent heroine, and those of judgment toward the other siblings, who were children of the video's villains. The school principal, a serious woman of principles, called Jennifer to her office. "Ma'am, we are very worried. Your mother-in-law's situation is serious. This is affecting the children and the school environment. We need to talk seriously about this." Jennifer tried to defend herself, to scream, to deny the truth, to blame Margaret, but the principal didn't let her. Margaret's voice recorded in the video was stronger than any excuse or lie. The humiliation had turned against them, like a boomerang thrown with fury. The villains, as they were called in internet comments, were now the center of attention, but not in the way they liked. Their private life, previously hidden behind the walls of their house and appearances, was now exposed to public scrutiny, stripped bare before everyone's eyes. Calls from relatives, friends, neighbors didn't stop, filling their phones with reproaches and demands, some with indignation, others with shame, all demanding explanations, asking for something to be done for the poor old woman. Stephen and Jennifer's life, previously so controlled, so full of appearances, crumbled under the weight of truth, like a house of cards. Jennifer, in an attack of uncontrollable fury, screamed at anyone who dared to call her, with a voice hoarse from yelling so much. "It's a lie! That old woman is crazy! I'm going to put her in a nursing home right now. I won't let her ruin my life." But her screams were useless, her words empty. Margaret's voice, calm and painful in the video, was more powerful than any tantrum or threat. People had already taken sides. Empathy for the grandmother was overwhelming, and condemnation toward them implacable. There was no escape. Miss Margaret, oblivious to the magnitude of the commotion her video had caused, felt strangely calm. The calls, Jennifer's screams, the whispers in the house, all that was noise. The noise of a truth coming to light, the thunder of a castle collapsing. She didn't fully understand what viral or social media meant, but she felt the change in the house's atmosphere. Jennifer's gaze, previously so defiant and cruel, was now loaded with panic and despair. Stephen's, previously indifferent and evasive, now showed a mixture of fear, regret, and deep shame. The humiliation they had inflicted on her for so long was now returning to them multiplied by 1,000. The shame she had felt in silence in the solitude of her room was now theirs, exposed for all to see, with nowhere to hide. It was a strange, silent justice, moving by invisible threads of public opinion. But it was undeniable and powerful. The grandmother sitting in her room listened to the echoes of the storm she had unleashed, and for the first time in a long time felt a glimmer of hope, a light at the end of the tunnel. The truth was finally coming out, and with it the possibility of real change in her life. The house had become a silent battlefield, a place where tension was so dense it could almost be cut with a knife. Jennifer's screams were sporadic now, turned into furious whispers or choked sobs, but the atmosphere of conflict was constant, palpable in every corner. Stephen walked the halls with his head down, avoiding his mother's gaze, plunged into a muteness that wasn't peace, but fear and shame. Public scandal had cornered them, and humiliation floated in the air like poison. Miss Margaret, for her part, felt a strange calm, a lucidity she hadn't experienced in years. The video had been a relief, a scream that had resonated beyond what she ever imagined. But she knew that truth alone, though powerful, wasn't enough to change everything. She needed more. She needed proof, something tangible to back up her words, something that couldn't be denied or distorted by Jennifer's lies. Sitting on the edge of her mattress, in the gloom of her room, Margaret began to think with surprising clarity. Proof of what? That they had taken her pension? That that house Jennifer said was only hers and from which she could be kicked out at any moment, had something to do with her money, with her past? Her mind, though tired by years and suffering, began to spin memories, to connect scattered dots. She remembered old conversations with Stephen, forgotten promises, documents she had signed without fully understanding, trusting blindly in her son, in her flesh and blood. She remembered the time Stephen had asked her to sign some bank papers or government forms, always with haste and the excuse that it was for her own good. Her eyes landed on a small wooden box, old and worn, that she kept under her mattress. It was her only treasure, a chest of memories from a past life, a refuge for her identity, a yellowed photo of Robert, her husband, with the smile she missed so much. A rosary her mother had given her on her deathbed. A few letters from her deceased siblings with ink faded by time. It was a place where she kept what was left of her history, of her essence. Her trembling fingers brushed against the velvet lining of the box, and for a moment, the smell of the past overwhelmed the stench of her present misery. These weren't just papers. They were the frozen hours of her life. Every receipt represented a double shift at the factory. Every mortgage document was signed with hands that were aching from labor, but steady with love for her son. Realizing that these sacrifices had been twisted into the very chains that now bound her, sparked a fire in her belly. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about reclaiming the sanctity of her motherhood that they had stolen and soiled. With trembling hands, she took it out carefully, feeling the weight of the years in her joints, and opened it with a sigh. The smell of old paper and memories rose in the air, bringing with it echoes of better times. She began to remove objects with care, each with its own story, each a piece of her soul. A lock of hair from her first child, a handkerchief embroidered by her grandmother, a medal of the Virgin she always carried with her. Beneath the velvet lining of the worn wooden box, Margaret found what she was looking for. They weren't just memories, they were ammunition. She pulled out a stack of yellowed documents, the original deed to the house and years of bank statements. There, in black and white, was the undeniable truth. The down payment hadn't come from Stephen's savings. It had come from the sale of her own cottage. The monthly mortgage payments weren't paid by Jennifer's salary, but were automatically deducted from Margaret's account, labeled deceivingly as living expenses by her son. She wasn't a guest in their home. Legally, she was the majority owner. They were original mortgage papers, and on them her name appeared as a co-signer, or at least as someone who had contributed a considerable sum for the entrance, for the down payment. She didn't understand complicated legal terms, clauses, and numbers, but the idea was clear, undeniable. Part of her money, her effort, her life, had served to buy that house. This is the game changer we've been waiting for. Those papers aren't just old receipts, they are the undeniable proof that Margaret isn't a burden, but the rightful owner. Now, armed with the truth, she has the ammunition to fight back, but confronting her family will require a courage she hasn't felt in years. Let's see how she plans to use this new weapon. That same house Jennifer told her wasn't hers, that belonged to them, and from which she could be thrown into the street at any moment. The irony was cruel, but the truth was now her ally. Margaret felt a wave of emotions invading her. Pain for the betrayal, yes, but also immense clarity and renewed strength. Not only did she have her voice in the video, a scream that had resonated in the world, now she had the proof, papers, signatures, numbers. Things that couldn't be denied, couldn't be hidden. Things that in the adult world, the world of laws and justice, had weight, had value, were irrefutable. The dignity she had proclaimed she still possessed in the video now had tangible backing, material support. It wasn't just her word against theirs. It was her word, her video, and now her papers. She put the documents away carefully, with a new determination igniting her soul. She didn't know what to do with them immediately, nor who to show them to, nor how to use them. But Chloe's idea to Record so everyone sees now extended a new and powerful possibility. Show so everyone knows, and so justice acts. The spark of hope Chloe had ignited in her heart now became a larger, brighter flame, a torch illuminating the path. She wouldn't die silent. And not only that, she wouldn't leave that house without fighting for what was hers, for what had been stolen from her. The battle was just beginning, and now Margaret had her weapons ready to be used. After finding the papers, a new kind of energy filled Margaret. It wasn't the frantic energy of fear, but a calm and firm determination. The documents, though old and fragile, felt like a shield in her trembling hands. They were proof, undeniable proof, that her suffering wasn't just an invention of her imagination or the ravings of an old woman, as Jennifer used to insinuate. This was real, tangible evidence of the injustice she had endured. The idea of confronting Stephen and Jennifer with these papers filled her with a mixture of apprehension and a burning desire for justice. She knew she couldn't face it alone. She was old, her voice was often dismissed, and her spirit, though now rekindled, had been worn down by years of abuse. She needed help, someone who understood the language of those papers, someone who could speak for her when her own voice faltered. Her mind went immediately to Chloe. The little girl, with her innocent bravery, had been the catalyst for everything. It was Chloe who had given her the idea for the video, Chloe who had shown her that her voice mattered, that her story deserved to be heard. And now it was Chloe she felt could help her navigate this new and daunting path. The next morning, while the sun barely peeked through the dirty window of her room, Margaret gathered the papers carefully. She folded them neatly, her arthritic fingers moving with surprising precision, and placed them inside a worn cloth bag she used for her few belongings. Her heart beat a little faster, a rhythm of anticipation and hope. When Chloe came to see her, as she used to do, Margaret looked at her with eyes full of a new purpose. "Chloe," she whispered, her voice a little hoarse from disuse, "I need your help again." Chloe, feeling the change in her grandmother's demeanor, nodded, her young face serious. Margaret explained as simply as she could about the papers, about the money, about the house. Chloe listened intently, her forehead wrinkled in concentration. "We have to go to a place where they can see this," Margaret concluded. "To a place where they help people like me." Chloe, without hesitation, understood. She knew of a place, a social services office in the neighborhood where people went when they had problems. She had seen her mother go there once, years ago, for some paperwork. Leaving the house without drawing attention was a small victory in itself. Stephen was at work, and Jennifer was usually absorbed in her phone or her own affairs in the living room. Chloe, with the stealth of a young cat, guided her grandmother out the back door through the small, dusty patio and onto the street. Margaret, leaning heavily on her cane, felt the morning air on her face, a sense of freedom she hadn't truly felt in years. The walk to the social services office was slow, every step a small effort for Margaret's aching joints. But Chloe remained by her side, a silent and unwavering support. The little girl's hand, small and warm, clung to Margaret's arm, guiding her, protecting her. The office was a modest building, a bit run down, but full of a quiet hum of activity. People sat on worn benches, waiting their turn, their faces marked by worries and hopes. Margaret felt a pang of nervousness. She wasn't used to going out, being among strangers, asking for help. But Chloe's presence, her quiet strength, gave her courage. They waited what seemed like an eternity. Minutes stretched into hours, but Margaret didn't complain. She had waited a lifetime for this. When her turn finally came, a young woman with kind eyes and a serious demeanor called her number. She introduced herself as Sarah, a legal aid attorney. Margaret, with Chloe translating some of the more complex terms, laid out her story. She spoke of the abuse, the stolen pension, the house. She spoke of the video which Sarah had already seen, her eyes widening with recognition. Then, with trembling hands, Margaret presented the papers. Sarah took them, her expression changing from empathy to professional focus. She examined every document meticulously. The pension receipts with suspicious notes, the old mortgage papers where Margaret's name appeared. The silence in the small office was only interrupted by the rustling of paper and the soft click of Sarah's pen. While Sarah reviewed the documents, Margaret watched her face, looking for any sign of doubt or dismissal, but there was none. Instead, Sarah's expression hardened, a flash of indignation in her eyes. After what seemed like an eternity, Sarah looked up, her gaze firm and direct. "Miss Margaret," she said, her voice firm but compassionate, "you have rights, and we are going to make them listen." These words, simple but powerful, resonated deeply in Margaret's soul. "These documents," Sarah continued, touching the papers, "are very important evidence. This isn't just a case of mistreatment, it's a case of fraud and financial abuse. And the house has a legal connection to you." Margaret felt a wave of relief run through her, so deep it almost made her cry. It was no longer just her word. It was her word, her video, and now these irrefutable papers, all validated by a professional, by someone who understood the law. Sarah explained the next steps. They would file an official complaint, gather more evidence, and prepare a legal case. She assured Margaret she would represent her, that they would fight for her rights. "Don't worry, Miss Margaret," Sarah said with a reassuring smile on her face. "We are going to see that justice is done, and we are going to ensure you recover what is yours and live with the dignity you deserve." Upon leaving the office, Margaret felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The walk back home, though still slow, felt different. The air seemed fresher, the sunlight brighter. Chloe, feeling her grandmother's renewed spirit, squeezed her hand. Margaret looked at her granddaughter. A silent promise passed between them. The battle was far from over, but now they had an ally, a professional, someone who could use the law like a sword. The truth, armed with proof and legal backing, was no longer just a whisper in the dark. It was a roar, ready to be unleashed. The days following the visit to the legal aid office were loaded with silent, latent tension. Stephen and Jennifer, still reeling from the public outcry caused by the video, moved through the house like ghosts, their usual loud arguments replaced by furious, muffled whispers. Jennifer's face was often contorted with a mixture of rage and fear. Her eyes darted nervously, as if she expected the world to collapse on her at any moment. Stephen, on the other hand, had withdrawn even further into himself, his silence a heavy cloak of shame and regret. He avoided eye contact with Margaret, his movements rigid and uncertain whenever he was near her. The house, which was once a fortress of their control, now felt like a cage, closing in on them with every passing moment. Margaret, however, found a new peace amidst the chaos. Knowing that Sarah, the attorney, was working on her case, that justice was finally underway, filled her with quiet strength. She still remained mostly in her small room, but now it felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary, a place where she could organize her thoughts and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. Chloe, her little accomplice, remained her shadow, providing small comforts, whispering words of encouragement, and sharing snippets of news she overheard from her parents' hushed conversations. Stephen's birthday arrived, a date that had always been marked by a forced celebration, a performance of family unity that rarely felt genuine. This year, however, was different. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the usual festive preparations overshadowed by the lingering shadow of the viral video. Jennifer, despite her internal torment, insisted on a semblance of normality, inviting a few relatives and close friends, perhaps in a desperate attempt to project an image of stability and innocence. The dining table was set with a modest spread of food. The aroma of cooked food filled the house, but the usual laughter and cheerful chatter were notably absent. A forced politeness floated in the air, a fragile facade threatening to break at any moment. Margaret knew this was her moment. Sarah had advised her to wait for the right time, a time when the impact would be greatest, when their secrets were exposed before witnesses. And what better stage than a family gathering, a supposed celebration for Stephen, the same son who had let her suffer in silence. Chloe, feeling the gravity of the occasion, stayed close to her grandmother, her small hand squeezing Margaret's with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Margaret had dressed in her cleanest clothes, though worn, her hair neatly combed. She wanted to face them with dignity, not as the old trash they called her, but as the woman who had endured, who had fought, and who was now ready to reclaim her life. When the guests began to arrive, some aunts and uncles, some cousins who rarely visited, the atmosphere became even more tense. Stephen, looking uncomfortable and pale, greeted them with forced smiles. Jennifer, despite her attempts to appear serene, frequently checked her phone. Her eyes moved around the room as if expecting an ambush. The superficial conversation was awkward, peppered with long silences, everyone aware of the elephant in the room, the video, the scandal, the unspoken truth weighing in the air. The cake adorned with candles remained untouched on the counter, a symbol of a celebration that felt anything but joyful. Then, just when everyone was seated around the table, a deathly silence took over the room. The front door opened, and Margaret stepped across the threshold, her figure silhouetted against the fading afternoon light. By her side, holding her hand, was Chloe, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and pride, and behind them, a tall, professional-looking woman dressed in a smart suit, her expression serious and determined. It was Sarah, the attorney. A collective gasp ran through the room. Stephen's fork fell onto his plate. His face paled. Jennifer's eyes opened wide, her mouth open, a silent scream trapped in her throat. The other relatives, who had been whispering among themselves, froze, their conversations dying on their lips. All eyes were on Margaret, who despite her frail appearance radiated an unexpected aura of power. She walked slowly and deliberately toward the dining room, her gaze fixed on Stephen and Jennifer, her head held high. Chloe, her small hand still firmly gripping her grandmother's, walked with her, a silent guardian, a testament to the bond that had grown between them. Margaret stopped at the head of the table directly in front of Stephen and Jennifer, her eyes meeting theirs with a look that contained no anger, only deep, unwavering determination. The air crackled with anticipation, every person in the room holding their breath, feeling that something momentous was about to happen. The tension in this room is palpable, and for the first time, the fear isn't coming from Margaret, but from the bullies who thought they were untouchable. Watching the balance of power shift like this is incredibly satisfying, but Jennifer isn't going to go down without a fight. Don't go anywhere, because the justice about to be served is absolutely delicious. The birthday dinner, meant to be a facade of happiness, had become the stage for a confrontation that would forever alter the lives of everyone present. The truth, long suppressed, was about to be unleashed. The silence in the dining room was so deep it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on everyone. All eyes were fixed on Margaret, standing at the head of the table, her small figure radiating unexpected authority. Stephen remained motionless, face pale, unable to look his mother in the eye. Jennifer, however, recovered quickly from her initial surprise. Her eyes narrowed in furious defiance. She wasn't one to be intimidated, especially not in her own house, and certainly not by the old trash she had controlled for so long. Now I can speak. Margaret's voice, though soft, cut the tension like a sharp knife. It was a question, but also a statement, a vindication of her right to speak, a right that had been denied to her for years. Jennifer, with her face contorted by a mixture of rage and panic, finally found her voice, a harsh, guttural sound. "You have nothing to say, useless old woman. Get out of my house, get out of my sight. How dare you come here with your lies and antics?" Her words were loaded with venom, a desperate attempt to regain control, to dismiss Margaret, to make her disappear. She began to rise from her chair, hands clenched into fists, ready to unleash her usual torrent of abuse. But before she could fully stand, Sarah, the attorney, took a step forward, her presence a quiet but firm barrier. "Ma'am," Sarah's voice was clear and professional, "I ask you to remain calm. We are here to discuss important legal matters." Her gaze was firm, unwavering, a silent warning to Jennifer. Margaret, ignoring Jennifer's outburst, looked directly at Stephen, her son, the man who had stood by and watched her suffer. There was no accusation in her eyes, only deep sadness, quiet disappointment. Then she turned her gaze to Jennifer, her voice gaining strength, every word deliberate and clear, resonating through the hushed room. "This house," her voice began firmly, "this house that you say is yours alone, that you threaten to throw me out of at any moment." She paused, letting the words float in the air, allowing the full weight of her statement to sink in. Then, with a slow and deliberate movement, Margaret reached into the worn cloth bag she carried and pulled out a thick envelope. It was the same envelope Sarah had given her, full of the documents she had found in her old wooden box, now organized and presented with legal precision. She held it up for all to see, not triumphantly, but with quiet, undeniable authority. "This house," she repeated, her voice louder now, "was bought with part of my pension, with my money, with my life's work." A collective murmur spread among the relatives gathered at the table. Their eyes moved from Margaret to the envelope, then to Stephen and Jennifer, their faces a mixture of surprise, confusion, and dawning realization. They had heard the rumors, seen the video, but this was different. This was a direct accusation backed by something tangible, something that carried legal weight. Jennifer's face turned red. A furious flush spread across her cheeks. "That's a lie. Are you crazy? That old woman is inventing everything. She's a manipulator," she screamed, her voice rising in pitch, her hands trembling with uncontrollable fury. She lunged forward as if to snatch the envelope from Margaret's hand, but Sarah subtly stepped in, blocking her path. "I have proof," Margaret continued, her voice unwavering, completely ignoring Jennifer's desperate denials. "Here are the receipts. Here are the mortgage papers. My name, my signatures, my pension money used to pay for this house." She didn't scream, didn't accuse with anger, simply laid out the facts, letting the raw, hard truth speak for itself. Her dignity, which she had declared she still possessed in the video, was now on full display, backed by irrefutable proof. Stephen, who had remained silent and motionless, finally moved. He looked at the envelope, then at his mother, a flicker of something like fear and regret in his eyes. He knew. He had always known. He had been a silent accomplice, a willing participant in the deception. And now the truth was laid bare for all to see. The comfortable silence he had maintained, the convenient blindness he had cultivated, had finally betrayed him. Margaret then looked directly at Jennifer, her gaze piercing the younger woman's anger and denial. Her voice lowered slightly, becoming a quiet, chilling promise. "And you, Jennifer," Margaret whispered, her voice devoid of anger but heavy with the weight of a judge delivering a sentence. She leaned closer, her eyes locking onto her daughter-in-law's terrified gaze. "You will never raise your voice, your hand, or your shoe at me again. Not because you don't want to, but because you will no longer have the roof to do it under." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a tyrant's power evaporating instantly in the face of truth. Margaret didn't need to scream. Her dignity roared louder than Jennifer's rage ever could. The air in the room crackled with the weight of Margaret's words. The relatives who had come for a birthday celebration were now witnesses to a family drama of epic proportions, a public reckoning. The facade of normality had crumbled, revealing the ugly truth underneath. Jennifer, for the first time, seemed to shrink, her fury momentarily eclipsed by a dawning realization of the gravity of the situation. The video had been a public humiliation, but this was a legal challenge, a direct threat to her control, to her life as she knew it. The house, her supposed sanctuary, was now the very stage where her lies were being exposed, piece by piece, before the very people she had tried to impress. The power had shifted. Margaret, the old trash, was no longer defenseless. She was armed with the truth, evidence, and the law, and she was ready to fight. The air in the dining room, which moments before had been laden with the scent of birthday food and false cheer, was now a dense, suffocating weight. Tension was so palpable, it seemed to vibrate in the atmosphere, making the glasses on the table seem to tremble slightly. Jennifer's face, once a mask of superiority, had transformed into a grimace of disbelief and barely contained fury. Her eyes, once full of contempt, now burned with a mixture of panic and rage, fixed on the envelope Margaret held with surprising calm. Margaret's statement, "And you, Jennifer, aren't going to yell at me anymore?" Never. Had resonated like thunder in the stunned silence, breaking the facade of normality Jennifer had tried to maintain. The other relatives, who had arrived expecting a celebration, were now frozen in their chairs, their gazes going from Margaret to Jennifer like spectators of a drama unfolding before their eyes, one that far exceeded any gossip they might have heard. The viral video had been a blow, but this direct and legal confrontation was a bomb. Jennifer, unable to process the magnitude of what was happening, reacted with the instinctive fury of a cornered animal. "Lie! You're crazy, old woman! I don't believe you! Don't you dare invent things in my house on my birthday!" Her voice was a shrill shriek, a desperate attempt to deny reality, to erase the evidence with the sheer force of her rage. She lunged forward, her hand outstretched like a claw, not to hit, but to snatch, to destroy the papers representing the end of her control. She wanted to make them disappear, as if by doing so the truth they contained would also vanish. But Sarah, the attorney, was faster. With an agility that surprised everyone, she stepped between Jennifer and Margaret, a silent but unbreakable barrier. Her hand, firm and professional, intercepted Jennifer's arm before she could reach the documents, stopping her dead in her tracks. "Ma'am," Sarah's voice was calm, almost monotone, but her authority was undeniable, every word a precise blow. "I ask you to restrain yourself. This is a legal matter, and these documents are irrefutable evidence." Sarah held up her own copy of the notification, a crisp, official paper contrasting with the emotional chaos of the room. "This is a formal notification, a legal notice, and it is already filed with the court." The phrase, "filed with the court," resonated with an echo of finality, a legal term meaning the process was already underway, that there was no turning back. Jennifer seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of those words, the realization of their legal meaning beginning to seep into her mind. Her desperate attempt to destroy the papers was useless. The law had already taken note. Jennifer stepped back, her face contracted in a grimace of despair and rage. Her eyes, wild and wide, moved from Sarah to Margaret, then to Stephen, who remained sunk in his chair, gaze fixed on the tablecloth, unable to look up. Stephen's silence was a betrayal deeper than any word. The slow, painful realization began to dawn on Jennifer. This wasn't just a family fight, one of the many she had won by intimidation. It was a legal battle. Margaret, the woman she had despised and humiliated, had arrived armed with the law, with the truth. The power dynamic she had enjoyed for so long was reversing irreversibly. The control she had exercised over Margaret, over Stephen, over the very narrative of their lives, was slipping through her fingers like fine sand. "No, this can't be. This is my house, my life." "You have no right," Jennifer shrieked, her voice breaking with absolute despair. Her eyes searched frantically around the room, as if she could find an exit, an escape door, a way to undo the last few minutes, to rewind time to when Margaret was just a silent, suffering presence in the back room. She looked at Stephen, a desperate plea in her eyes. But Stephen remained impassive, his silence a resounding confirmation of his guilt and his inability to support her, now that the consequences of his actions were staring them in the face. Sarah, unperturbed by Jennifer's outburst, continued with a calm bordering on clinical. "Miss Margaret is a co-owner of this dwelling. Her pension funds were used for the purchase and maintenance of this property, without her proper consent or with consent obtained under coercion. We have the bank records, receipts, and Miss Margaret's testimony." Every word was a sure blow, a nail in the coffin of Jennifer's control, a precise legal statement dismantling her claims. Sarah didn't need to raise her voice. The weight of the law was in every syllable she pronounced. She extended the notification toward Jennifer, offering it with a firm gesture. Jennifer, in a last desperate act of defiance, slapped the paper from Sarah's hand. "I don't want to see any of this. It's a lie. It's all a lie, isn't it true?" The paper fluttered to the floor, an insignificant object in the maelstrom of her despair. But Sarah simply bent down, picked it up with a serene expression, and placed it on the table in front of Stephen, who still didn't move. "It doesn't matter if you read it or not, ma'am. You are already notified, and everything is on the public record. This means the law is already in motion. It is a process that cannot be stopped by ripping up a paper." Her tone was firm, leaving no room for doubt or further argument. The act of ripping the paper was insignificant. The legal process had already begun its unstoppable course. Margaret watched Jennifer not with loud triumph, but with a quiet, almost tired sense of vindication. The years of silent suffering, of being ignored, of seeing her dignity stripped away, were finally being recognized. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't a desire to see Jennifer suffer the same way she had suffered. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully hers. Not just the house, but her voice, her dignity, her very existence. Chloe, still holding Margaret's hand, squeezed it gently, a silent message of support and understanding. The little girl, who had once been a helpless witness to her grandmother's pain, was now a silent participant in her liberation, a beacon of bravery. The other relatives, who had been uncomfortable witnesses to Margaret's public humiliation by Jennifer in the past, now shifted even more uncomfortably in their seats. Some exchanged furtive glances, others looked at their plates, suddenly finding the porcelain designs fascinating. The truth, once a whispered rumor, was now a loud, undeniable fact, exposed to the light of day. The image of the perfect family Stephen and Jennifer had tried so desperately to maintain had shattered spectacularly. The birthday dinner, meant to be a facade of happiness and normality, had turned into a public reckoning, a stage for Miss Margaret's long-delayed justice. The papers, once hidden and dismissed, now had the power to change everything, to rewrite the history of that house and that family forever. The days following the disastrous birthday dinner were a whirlwind of legal paperwork. Every step, a nail in the coffin of the life Jennifer had built on Margaret's back. Tension inside the house was unbearable. Heavy air that could be cut with a knife. Jennifer's silent fury, unable now to lash out physically or verbally against Margaret, boiled under the surface, manifesting in violent door slams, in the furious clinking of dishes being washed, and in icy stares Margaret felt even when Jennifer had her back turned. Stephen, for his part, remained a silent, defeated figure, his usual cheerfulness, or what was left of it, replaced by a heavy, palpable guilt that hunched him over. He moved through the house like a ghost, his steps dragging, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially Margaret. The other relatives, having witnessed the public spectacle, kept their distance, phone calls to Stephen and Jennifer diminishing until they disappeared completely. Social isolation was a new form of punishment, an inescapable consequence of their actions now exposed to the whole world. Sarah, the attorney, worked with speed and efficiency that surprised Margaret. Every day brought a new document, a new confirmation of the solidity of her case. The evidence was overwhelming. Receipts signed by Margaret showing the diversion of her pension funds, bank statements detailing transactions, original property titles confirming her contribution, and most powerful of all, the viral video that had exposed the abuse to millions, turning Margaret into a symbol of dignity for the elderly. Jennifer's desperate attempts to deny the truth, to deflect blame, to paint Margaret as a senile and manipulative old woman, crumbled under the undeniable weight of facts. Her lawyers, if she bothered to hire any, found themselves with an unwinnable case, a mountain of evidence they couldn't refute. Then the day came. A sheriff's deputy, with his impeccable uniform and impassive face, knocked on the door. In his hands he held a formal order. It was a crisp, official document, devoid of emotion, but every word carried the full weight of the law. Jennifer was ordered to vacate the property. The house bought with Margaret's pension was legally recognized as acquired by fraudulent means, and Margaret's rights as co-owner, and in fact the main contributor to its purchase, were confirmed beyond doubt. The order gave Jennifer a short deadline to collect her belongings and leave. It was a resounding, undeniable decree, the end of an era of abuse. When the news was delivered, Jennifer exploded. Her screams resonated through the house, a mixture of disbelief, uncontrollable rage, and absolute despair, making her look like a wounded beast. "No, you can't do this to me. This is my house, my life. It's an injustice, a trap. This old woman wants to destroy me," she screamed, throwing objects to the floor with fury, pulling her hair. Her carefully constructed world crumbling around her with a deafening crash. She turned to Stephen, her eyes burning with accusation, a fury seeking a scapegoat. It's all your fault. You didn't do anything. You let that old woman do this to us. You're useless, a coward." Stephen, for the first time in a long time, looked up and looked at Jennifer. But there was no anger in his eyes, not even resentment, only deep, exhausting weariness, a resignation that had consumed him completely. He had no defense, nor words of comfort to offer. He had chosen his path, his silence, his complicity with Jennifer's abuse, and now he had to live with the consequences of those choices. He simply turned around, shoulders slumped, a man destroyed by the weight of his own inaction. He didn't defend Jennifer, didn't argue against the order, simply accepted it. A silent acknowledgement of his own complicity and the inevitable result he himself had helped forge. Margaret watched everything from her small room with the door slightly ajar. She heard Jennifer's hysterical screams, Stephen's deafening silence, the hurried steps of the official leaving. There was no joy in her heart, nor a sense of triumphant revenge, only quiet, deep relief, a liberation felt in every fiber of her being. It was over. The constant fear, the daily humiliation, the feeling of being trapped in a cage with no exit, everything was finally ending. The house, which had been a prison, would soon be hers again. A place where she could breathe freely, where peace wouldn't be a luxury, but a right. Jennifer's departure was a chaotic and noisy affair. She packed her belongings frantically, throwing things into boxes without care, muttering curses under her breath, her face contorted by anger and resentment. She didn't say goodbye to anyone, not even her own children, whom she left behind without a glance. Her exit was as dramatic and self-centered as her presence had always been. The sound of the front door slamming shut behind her resonated through the now strangely silent house. A final, definitive echo marking the closing of a long, painful chapter in Margaret's life. Seeing Jennifer finally face the consequences of her greed proves that sooner or later, the truth always finds a way to the surface. Margaret's victory is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity. If this story of resilience moved you, please stick around for the heartwarming conclusion between a grandmother and the little girl who saved her life. After Jennifer left, a strange, deep silence took over the house. It was a silence Margaret hadn't experienced in years, a silence not filled with fear of an imminent outburst or heavy, unspoken resentment. It was a peaceful silence, a silence allowing her to hear the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant singing of birds in the garden, the soft whisper of leaves outside. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if a toxic cloud had finally dissipated, leaving a clear sky. Stephen remained in the house for a while, a shadow of his former self. He avoided Margaret, retreating to his room, coming out only for essentials. The dynamic between mother and son was broken, perhaps irreparably. Margaret felt a pang of sadness for him, for the son she had raised with so much love, who had opted to turn a blind eye to her suffering. But there was also firm resolve in her heart. She had fought for her dignity and wouldn't allow herself to be subjected to such treatment ever again, not even from her own son. Distance was necessary to heal. Chloe, however, was a beacon of light in that new stillness. When Jennifer left, the little girl came out of her room, face still pale from the recent agitation, but a small, hopeful smile on her lips. She walked directly to Margaret's room, eyes shining with relief. Margaret looked at her granddaughter, and a wave of warmth invaded her. Chloe, with her innocent bravery, had been the catalyst, the unlikely heroine who had set everything in motion, who had lit the spark of justice. "Grandma," Chloe whispered, soft voice, relief evident in every syllable. "She's gone. I didn't need to say who." Margaret simply nodded, a soft smile adorning her lips, a smile she hadn't felt in a long time. Chloe then did something she hadn't dared to do in years. She hugged her grandmother tightly, burying her face in Margaret's shoulder. Margaret returned the hug, holding her granddaughter close, feeling the warmth of her small body, the beat of her young heart. It was a hug full of relief, gratitude, and the promise of a new beginning. The house was hers again, and more importantly, her dignity was restored. And Chloe, her brave little angel, was by her side, living proof that kindness and bravery always find their way. With Jennifer out of the house, and Stephen retreating into his own world of silent remorse, the house began to transform slowly, like a body recovering from a long illness. The oppressive atmosphere that had weighed for years dissipated, replaced by a quiet, deep sense of peace. Margaret, no longer confined to her small, moldy back room, began to reclaim her space, every corner of the house that had been denied to her. She sat in the living room, a place she hadn't dared to occupy freely, feeling the sunlight coming through the window, a warmth she hadn't truly felt in her bones for a long time, a warmth going beyond the physical. Freedom was intoxicating, a simple luxury cruelly denied to her for years, and now she savored it in every moment. But more than physical space, it was emotional space that truly expanded for Margaret. The constant fear, the need to be invisible, the stabbing anxiety of Jennifer's next outburst, everything had disappeared like a bad dream upon waking. Margaret could breathe deeply, without the weight of imminent humiliation on her shoulders. She could move at her own pace, eat when she was hungry without worrying about cold leftovers, rest when she was tired without asking permission or fearing retaliation. It was a return to basic human dignity, a fundamental right she had almost forgotten she possessed, a sense of owning her own time and body. Chloe became Margaret's constant companion, her luminous little shadow, the girl, no longer living under the shadow of her mother's volatile and cruel temper, bloomed like a flower finally receiving sunlight. Her laughter, once repressed and silent, now resonated through the house, a sweet, liberating sound. She sat with Margaret for hours, reading her school books with her clear, young voice, or simply sharing stories about her day, her small discoveries, and her dreams. Their bond, forged in shared suffering and a secret act of bravery, deepened into an unbreakable connection, a tie neither time nor hardship could break. Chloe had been the light in Margaret's darkest moments, the small hand that had pulled her out of the abyss of despair. One afternoon, while they sat on the small porch bathed by the setting sun, watching the world go by with its slow rhythm, Margaret reached out and gently took Chloe's hand. The little girl looked up with wide, trusting eyes, full of an innocence Margaret had promised herself to protect. Margaret's own eyes, though still showing lines of a hard life and traces of past tears, now had a new shine, a reflection of the peace she finally felt, a light of gratitude. "Chloe," Margaret began, her voice soft, full of deep emotion she could barely contain. "You saved me." The words floated in the air, simple but immensely powerful, loaded with the weight of everything they had lived through. Chloe's eyes widened even more, a blush rising up her cheeks. She had never considered herself a savior, just a girl who with her pure heart wanted to help her grandmother stop suffering. "No, Grandma," Chloe whispered, shaking her head slightly, her humility so genuine. I just wanted you not to cry anymore. It hurt me to see you like that." Her innocence was heartbreaking, her motivation so pure and selfless. Margaret squeezed her hand, her old, arthritic fingers clinging to the warmth of her granddaughter's hand. "Yes, my child, you saved me. You gave me the strength I no longer had. You gave me the idea. That idea to record. You made me see I didn't have to stay silent, that my voice still mattered." She paused, remembering those dark nights, the silent tears soaking her pillow, the feeling of absolute hopelessness that had consumed her. "I was lost, Chloe. I had given up completely. I thought my life was worth nothing anymore, that I was just a burden, that I was the old trash they called me, without value, without a future." A shadow of the past crossed her face, but quickly vanished, replaced by overwhelming gratitude. "But you," Margaret continued, her voice acquiring quiet strength and unwavering conviction. "You weren't afraid. You were brave for me when I couldn't be for myself. You gave me your hand and showed me the way." She looked at Chloe with eyes full of held-back tears. Tears of gratitude, not sadness. "You did what no one else did, not even my own son, who turned his back on me. No one. Just you, my little one. You were my angel." Chloe looked down, a shy smile on her face, a gleam of pride in her eyes. She didn't fully comprehend the magnitude of her actions, the profound impact she had on her grandmother's life. For her, it had been a simple act of love, a girl's desire to relieve the suffering of the person she loved most. But for Margaret, it was everything. It was the turning point, the spark that had ignited her fight for dignity, the reason she could now sit in peace in her own home. "Thank you, my love," Margaret whispered, pulling Chloe into a gentle hug. It was a hug full of years of unspoken love, of gratitude transcending words, of a connection tested and strengthened by the fire of adversity. Chloe curled up on her grandmother's shoulder, feeling the warmth and safety of that hug, the steady beat of a heart now beating with hope. The outside world, with its legal battles and harsh realities, faded in that moment. Only the quiet, deep love between a grandmother and her granddaughter existed, a love that had triumphed over adversity and rebuilt a life. The future, once a bleak, terrifying prospect, now seemed to stretch before them, full of possibilities, however small and simple. Margaret knew it wouldn't be easy. She was old, her body was tired and marked by life, but her spirit, thanks to Chloe, was renewed, strong, and determined. They would build a new life together, a life free from fear and abuse, a life full of quiet dignity and the unbreakable bond they shared. Chloe, with her bright eyes and brave heart, wasn't just her granddaughter. She was her anchor, her hope, her salvation. And Margaret, once a silent victim, was now a survivor, a living testament to the power of a single act of kindness and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and with every sunrise, the house, once a place of fear and oppression, slowly became a home again, filled with the gentle rhythms of Margaret and Chloe's shared life. Stephen finally moved out, unable to face his mother or the lingering shame of his inaction and complicity. It was a quiet, necessary separation, without big goodbyes or dramas. Margaret didn't protest. The space he left allowed more light, more air, more peace in the home. The past, though never forgotten, was slowly receding, its sharp edges softening with every passing day of freedom, like a healing wound. Margaret spent her mornings on the small front porch, a place she now cherished as a personal sanctuary. The morning sun warmed her old bones, soothing the arthritis pain, and the gentle breeze brought the scent of flowers from the neighbor's garden, mixed with the sweet smell of freshly brewed coffee. Chloe often joined her, doing her homework at a small table or simply sitting in comfortable silence, their hands sometimes meeting, a quiet reaffirmation of their unbreakable bond. The world outside the porch, with its hustle and bustle, seemed distant, a faint echo of the life they had left behind, a life of fear and submission. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple, Margaret looked toward the street, watching children play and families stroll. Her mind naturally traveled to the past, to that fateful day when Jennifer had thrown the shoe at her. She remembered the stinging pain in her face, the humiliation that had burned her to the depths of her soul, the feeling that her life had truly ended, that there was no hope. She remembered the silent tears she had shed in the darkness of her small room, the desperate plea for help that had gone unnoticed by everyone except a brave girl, her little Chloe. And then she thought of the video, of the defiant words she had spoken with her trembling but firm voice, the truth she had dared to express to the world. "They hit my body, Chloe," Margaret said quietly, a murmur almost to herself, as if narrating a story only she could fully understand in all its magnitude. Chloe, who had been drawing in her notebook, looked up, feeling the reflective, deep tone in her grandmother's voice. "They threw a shoe in my face, called me trash, made me feel worth nothing, that I was a hindrance to everyone." She spoke without bitterness, simply stating the raw facts of her past suffering, as if telling a distant dream, a nightmare from which she had finally awakened. Chloe reached out and took Margaret's hand, her small fingers interlacing with her grandmother's knobby, marked ones. She remembered the blood on Margaret's face, the fear in her eyes, the anger she had felt at her mother's cruelty, but she also remembered the quiet determination in her grandmother's eyes when she spoke to the camera, that spark of bravery that had ignited everything. Under the warm glow of the afternoon sun, Margaret sat peacefully on her porch, letting the gentle breeze carry away the memories of those cold, humiliating days in the dark room. The old wound on her lip had long healed, replaced by a serene smile as she held tight to her granddaughter Chloe's hand. From the ashes of abandonment, she had risen like a resilient flower, proving that human dignity and the human spirit can never be extinguished. If you were moved by this true story of a courageous fight for justice, please subscribe to our channel to help us spread more meaningful messages.